First, salute the amazing speeches by our two senators from Georgia. Georgia, which has been the crucible in our fight for voting rights, where the attempts to curtail voting rights seem most pernicious. To both of you, your erudition, your eloquence, your passion were amazing. And I want to salute our Republican colleagues who listened to the speeches and hope that those who weren't here will get a chance to review those speeches as well. Now, I ask unanimous consent that the mandatory quorum call with respect to the pending cloture motion be waived.
Is there an objection? Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the following senators be permitted to complete their remarks prior to the scheduled vote: Senator Blunt, Senator Klobuchar, Senator Schumer.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam Vice President.
Senator from Missouri.
I've been on the floor most of the day today, and I think I've heard virtually every speech given. I was reminded again, as the day went on, of really the broad-based talent of people in the Senate. I spent some time a couple of years ago, over a course of about 6 months, kind of watching individual senators and trying to figure out how they got here. And with only a couple of exceptions, I could figure it out. That unique ability to communicate or to explain things in a way that people understood them, or to appear to just know more than other people knew about things that people knew senators need to know about. And I was reminded again of the tragedy of how little we use that collected talent. There's absolutely no telling what we could do if we would decide, as 100 people who figured out how to get to the United States Senate, how we'd work together and solve big problems. And I think we all know where we are today, but I do hope, as Senator Schumer mentioned, that we listen to each other as people express different views. Certainly the Senate would be a better place if we spent more time on the floor listening to each other and talking to each other. Now, on this bill, I think we all know where we're headed. In my view, having watched election legislation for a long time, it seems to me this is just another version of an election bill introduced by Democrats. There's not much new in this bill. Both the Rules Committee, where I serve, and the Senate have already rejected this federal takeover election several times this year. Now, many of my friends on the other side said, well, why wouldn't the Republicans just want to debate this bill? I don't think anybody said, why wouldn't the Republicans want to amend this bill? Because there was no opportunity to do that. We've been on the bill now for several days. Got on the bill, fairly crafty way to get on the bill with a 51 vote. Fine with me to be on the bill. But our friends on the other side decided there'd be no amendments on this bill. And I think Republicans from the very start sensed that this would be a bill where we'd get a yes or no vote on a bill that really would dramatically change how we pursue elections. Now, while it has a new name, it's more than 700 pages. It's nearly identical to the Freedom to Vote Act. It's substantially the same as the two versions that couldn't get 50 on that side of the S1. Very similar to the Senate bill, H.R. 1, and very similar, frankly, to the election bills that I've been watching for 20 years. And there's always been a different reason to do about the same Democrat-sponsored bill, House and Senate. After 2020, the reason was, well, the equipment is too faulty, and we've got to have more federal control of what happens in the states. After 2016, the reason to have a massive election bill was, well, there's just not enough security in state elections, and the federal government has to intervene in some major way. After 2020, even though the federal government didn't intervene in a major way, suddenly the elections were the most secure in the history of the world. Both parties alleged that at one point. And now we need to have this bill because some states are passing legislation that in most cases looks at the real outreach that they appropriately did for the pandemic, and thinking in 2021 that the pandemic was over, thinking, what do we want to keep of what we did in that outreach, and what do we want to decide we should only do during a pandemic? I haven't found very many places, if any, that couldn't be easily explained, like postal regulations and other things, where the states that made changes and rolled back their pandemic outreach don't have more opportunities to vote now than they had in 2018, the last election before they should have done extraordinary things. Actually, one lesson we probably taught state legislators here is don't do anything to try to meet an immediate moment, because if you try to undo any of it when that moment's passed, you'll get on what Senator Langford described as the bad list. He also did a pretty good job explaining that a lot of states that weren't on the bad list don't have nearly the opportunities to vote that the states that are on the bad list. You know, one of the things, I was an election official for about 20 years, including the Secretary of State for a good part of that, and I always thought that the diversity of the system was one of the strengths of the system. I thought, as President Obama did in 2016, that the diversity of the system made it really hard for outsiders or insiders to figure out how they could rig a national election. I still think that. This bill undermines really a lot of state voter laws that are pretty popular with voters, and we've seen that expressed even in recent elections in like New York City. Prohibiting voter identification for mail ballots would be one of the things that you wouldn't want to do. If you wanted to have mail-in ballots, you'd want to be sure where those came from, and frankly, you'd want to have an objective standard like your voter ID number or some other number that was uniquely yours than a subjective standard like how you signed your name when you were 18 as opposed to how you're signing your name when you're 68. That was one of the changes, by the way, in the Georgia law, which should have helped more people than not. This bill retains Senate Bill 1's mandate on ballot drop boxes, federalizes rules for redistricting. I think it chills free speech, requires felon voting. Now, why would anybody want to be against any of those things? There are reasons, frankly, to be against all of those things, but states make that decision for themselves, and in some states it may work very well, and others it might not. Of the top sweeping election administration changes in this bill, the S1 policies in this bill disrupt state efforts to maintain accurate voter rolls. Now, accurate voter rolls were seen as one of the great progressive moves forward, so you'd have some sense that the people who voted on Election Day were actually people who were supposed to vote, and also important to vote in that district. You know, if you just vote anywhere, and your legislative district where you should have voted was decided by 4 or 5 votes, and you were one of those 4 or 5, suddenly that's a big disservice to everybody else. The bill would spend federal money to send federal money to campaign coffers at the rate of $6 federal for every dollar raised. It even goes so far as to add a second public financing program that would give people $25 in federal funds to contribute to House candidates. Now, this 6-to-1 match is only for House candidates. That may not be what the final bill would say if we pass this bill, but it's only for House candidates now. And of course, this federal money would be eligible to be matched by 6-to-1 other federal dollars. That's a pretty good deal. You give somebody $25 federal dollars, and it could be matched with 6-to-1 other federal dollars. This bill sets up a framework that would result in, I think, every congressional district map likely to be drawn by federal courts. How many maps have we seen this time that were drawn by new improvements that the states made that didn't turn out to be, one, any better than the old maps, and two, wound up being drawn by judges. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Friend of mine, I served with him, I traveled with him, I laughed with him, I liked him a lot, I admired him a lot. The Voting Rights Act was 12 pages when it was introduced in 1965. The John Lewis voting right provisions here, which have a great name, but they're 120 pages. I voted to extend the Voting Rights Act, and I'd do it again. And I'd be proud to do it if it was named for John Lewis, but 735 pages, saying that if we don't vote for that 735 pages, somehow we're opposed to the Voting Rights Act or opposed to the heroism of John Lewis, I don't think so. Since it doesn't have the support to pass under the current Senate rules, the next thing we'll do is attempt to really gut the legislative filibuster to force it through. My Republican colleagues have spoken at length about the consequences of doing that, as has Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema just the other day. The justification rests on really a narrow basis that somehow the protection of the minority no longer matters. The danger of overturning 200 years of election administration by the state, I'm going to resist doing any of the quotes this late in the day that you've heard over and over again of our Democrat friends who just a couple of years ago were saying, or less than a handful of years ago, how critically important it was that those rules never be changed. You know, if Democrats eliminate the 60-vote rule for election legislation, there'll soon be no filibuster left. Today it would be carve out for the election administration. 3 or 4 weeks ago it was a carve out for the debt, raising the debt limit. The next carve out would be for whatever seems to be important that day. A carve out won't work. I don't think really anybody here believes that any longer. This would be the first step in just eliminating an important distinction that makes the Senate a place where we have to think about what we do. It eliminates some of the chaos that occurs when you have a party change. In the past 2 decades, a single party has controlled both chambers of the Congress and the presidency 4 times, alternating between Democrats and Republicans. The Senate is what has kept the country from wildly going from one direction back in the other. We don't want to lose that. The disaster for our citizens, the disaster for our economy of not having that sense of having to think about this just a little bit before you head in another direction is what the Senate is all about. I certainly hope my colleagues today will not pass this federal takeover of election laws and will also resist the temptation to change the rules of the Senate. And I yield the floor.
Madam Vice President.
The Senator from Minnesota.
I rise today after hearing from my friend, Senator Blunt. I remember on January 6th, as all of you do that day, when he and I and Vice President Pence and 2 young women with the mahogany box filled with the last of the ballots up to Wyoming took that long walk through the shattered glass, the spray-painted statues, and we did our jobs. And I will be forever grateful of what he did that night and what so many people in this chamber did. But for me, it didn't end that night. Because sadly, what wasn't accomplished by the people that rifled through these desks and got up on that dais, Madam Vice President, what wasn't accomplished with bear spray, what wasn't accomplished with the bayonets, and I still remember the blood on the officers' faces, sadly, has continued on. continued on. The votes that we took that night were important, but the votes that the people of this country take in every election are just as important. And that's why when you look at the freedom to vote, the John R. Lewis Act, you have to understand what it is grounded in. And that is our belief in our democracy. I want to thank every single member of the Democratic caucus that have worked so hard to agree on this bill. And I will say the Voting Rights Group, the Rules Committee, and I do differ from Senator Blunt on this. We spent a lot of time making changes to that bill over the year. We have made many changes in response to concerns from secretaries of state and local election officials all across this country. And I also thank you and the President for your leadership. Since this country's founding, when brave patriots rose up and ultimately established a country in the name of we the people, America has been a shining beacon for the world, a touchstone for democracy. We travel the world as senators, as Senator Shaheen and Portman and I and several of our Democratic and Republican colleagues did just this weekend when we went to decry dictators and bullies who attempt to undermine democracies, as Vladimir Putin is doing in Ukraine. We were proud on that trip to wear lapel pins with the Ukrainian flag on one side and the United States flag on the other. We are proud of our democracy, and that democracy is fundamentally based on the freedom to vote. Over the years, we've made improvements to address wrongs that kept too many Americans from joining in the rights on which our nation was founded. But generation after generation, Americans have believed that truly in our country's founding promise, that they've fought for it, they've died for it. We are here today against that backdrop of history, at a time when our democracy is facing a new wave of threats, a flood that has surged up since the 2020 elections, when more Americans cast a ballot than ever before as a pandemic raged. And it is up to us to turn back that tide and to preserve the right that lies at the bedrock of our system of government. And again, I disagree with Senator Blunt about what has been going on. I look at the law that was passed in Montana that Senator Tester described. That was set in place for 15 years for same-day registration in the state of Montana. 15 years. In the last election, 8,000 people took advantage of it on Election Day, either newly registering to vote or changing their address because they moved. It's just taken away from them with what one court described for another law years ago in North Carolina, surgical precision. Or you look at what our friends Senator Ossoff and Senator Warnock described of what has happened in Georgia. 70,000 people registered during that last weeks of the election in the runoff period. 70,000 people in the last election. That has been stripped away, passed into law, that cannot happen again. The Founding Fathers knew that our democracy would face obstacles. A lot of people have been quoting them. I'll quote this one, Samuel Adams. He said this: "The liberties of our country are worth defending at all hazards, and it is our duty to defend them against all attacks." When you have over 9,000 threats against members of Congress in just last year, double, triple what we've seen before, I don't see that walk we took, that really important walk, that all ended that day. When you have local election officials across this country being threatened, the names of their kids and their homes put out on the internet, like the Republican local election official in Senator Casey's home state of Pennsylvania, his house, his kids, with a threat that said, "Tell the truth or your 3 kids will be fatally shot." It's on all of us to uphold and protect this democracy. The Freedom to Vote, John R. Lewis Act, meets the challenges before us by establishing basic federal standards for our election, restoring and strengthening the Voting Rights Act, countering the power of secret money in our politics, and taking on new threats to our elections to ensure that every vote is properly counted. And again, let me read from the Constitution, from Article 1, Section 4. That clause empowers Congress to make or alter rules for federal elections at any time. At any time. As Senator Kaine noted, that's the only time at any time is used in the Constitution. At any time. The word filibuster isn't in this document. The word cloture isn't in this document. But it was anticipated that Congress could and should be involved in federal elections when necessary. What brought us to the point today? We're here in the midst of a concerted effort to stop people from exercising the most fundamental right in our democracy. Because, as Reverend Warnock has put so well, some people don't want some people to vote. We're here because the people of this country know what's going on. I'm talking about a veteran in Georgia who didn't have to stand in line to serve his country, but he had to I met him myself. He had to stand in line hours and hours and hours in the hot sun just to cast a ballot. We're here because those voters in Wisconsin who stood in the rain in homemade masks and garbage bags in the beginning of a pandemic just to exercise their right to vote. We're here because of a voter in a wheelchair in Texas who traveled 3 hours on 4 buses just to vote. A woman in Montana who had open heart surgery, uncertain about how to return her mail ballot. A former election official from a rural county who was ousted by Republicans in the Georgia legislature after a decade of service. And a 92-year-old woman who was purged from the rolls after voting in every election for decades since 1968. We're here because after record numbers of voters voted to make their voices heard, there are people, sadly, that are working in every state capital to make sure it never happens again. And I note that for every one of these laws that have passed in 19 different states, it has been with a simple majority, state by state by state, a simple majority. And then, as was noted by several of my colleagues, after this chamber has established over 160 carve-outs, 160 processes in law to allow for a final vote without a 160-vote threshold, whether it's for the debt ceiling, whether it's for the Bush tax cuts, whether it's for the Trump tax cuts, whether it is for Justice Amy Coney Barrett, 51 votes. Now we hear at this very moment that we must embrace this archaic rule that is not in the Constitution and did not exist when the Senate was founded. And we're not even talking about getting rid of this rule. We're simply talking about restoring the Senate to what it once was, so we can have debates and we can actually vote on bills when those debates have concluded and when the speeches are exhausted. We're here because we took an oath to defend the Constitution as we did that night on January 6th. We're here because we know that the eyes of the world are on us, watching to see if America will stand up and take on the challenges of our time. To paraphrase Dr. King, whose legacy has been honored many, many times today, while there may be finite disappointment in this country for so many people every day, we must never lose infinite hope. We're not losing it. That, my friends, is why we, on the Democratic side of the aisle, are supporting this bill. With history's eyes on us and with so much at stake, we must and we will fight on. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Madam Vice President.
Majority Leader.
Madam Vice President, what kind of democracy shall endure here in the United States long after our times in this chamber come to an end? Shall American democracy in the 21st century be called a true heir to our framers' vision? A nation where the people choose their own leaders, forge their own destiny, and add to the great legacies of those who expanded the franchise before us? Or shall we see American democracy backslide in our time, grow feeble in the jaws of its adversaries, and ultimately succumb to the cancer of voter suppression? The answer, in a large sense, could depend on how we move forward this evening. As we have clearly laid out over the past 2 days, the laws passed in legislatures throughout the country do nothing less than to discourage and prevent certain kinds of Americans, Black and brown Americans, young Americans, elderly Americans, low-income Americans, from participating in the democratic process. My colleagues, we can begin to put a stop to these attacks tonight by voting to proceed to the final passage of the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. These are good bills. These are effective bills, and they should be passed by this chamber as soon as possible. And if cloture is not invoked, we must change the rules of the Senate so we can pass these bills into law. As we cast our votes, I urge every one of us, Democrat and Republican, not to discount our place in history. The story of American democracy is full of contradictions and halting progress. At the time of our Constitution's ratification, you had to be in many states a white, male, Protestant landowner to vote. But ever since the early days of this grand republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws to expand the franchise until there were no more boundaries. Today's vote is the next step in that long march. Are we going to let our democracy backslide in the 21st century? Are we going to be dragged back into the abyss of voter suppression? I urge every one of my colleagues, left, right, and middle, for the sake of our democracy, unite, take a stand today. To every member of this body who treasures our precious experiment in self-rule, to every member horrified by the muck of voter suppression, and to everyone who believes this chamber is still capable of defending democracy in its hour of great need, I urge a yes vote. I yield the floor.
The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, do hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to concur in the House amendment to the Senate amendment to H.R. 5746, an act to amend Title 51, United States Code, to extend the authority of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration to enter into lease